Hi everybody, I hope you all enjoyed part 1 of the Scotland Cold War video. We are moving on to doing civilian life of Scotland during this time period. Unlike the military part of our subject, this is a much more advanced topic, if I may say, with a lot of social reforms in regards to Labour's victories, the multiple towns that formed during the time of the Cold War, and along the various lines of protests and governments. Anyhow, let's get right into it, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. After the Second World War, the Conservative Party lost the 1945 election due to a massive landslide with Labour, as we talked previously on part 1 of this decade under the Labour government was the implementation of the welfare state, including the creation of the NHS, otherwise known as the National Health Service in 1948, which provided free healthcare to all citizens. However, due to the previous bombings by the Luftwaffe, cities like Glasgow were overcrowded with dense tenement slums, and a plan was formed called the Clyde Valley Plan, which was to reduce the population of Glasgow and clear the slums, which led to new towns being established outside of Glasgow and mass housing schemes. However, during this post-war period, we saw the early decline of the industry of Scotland as a whole, such as the Lanarkshire coalfields were becoming too exhausted, and the Clyde shipyards faced increasing competition from overseas. And despite Labour's dominance during the general election and afterwards, many Scottish Unionist Party/Conservative members operated within the framework of the United Kingdom, focusing on the post-war British-level solutions. The 1960s. Scotland had found itself on the front line of the Cold War, with the establishment of Holy Loch, a US submarine facility in March of 1961, stationing US military forces in Scotland. This became a prime target in case of a nuclear war, where England decided on sacrificing Scotland in the need of a nuclear attack. But the base brought thousands of US naval personnel and their families to the small communities around Holy Loch, creating a distinctive American years period that influenced the local culture and the economy. And of course, later on that decade, the UK's own nuclear deterrent system was now based at Faslane, which is now Her Majesty's Naval Base near Helensburgh. This was also the site of the first British Polaris submarine. But due to the presence of nuclear weapons, it sparked a rise in anti-nuclear protests. This peaked during the 1961 demonstrations with the arrival of the USS Proteus. It was met with large-scale demonstrations. Protesters used canoes and small boats in symbolic attempts to block or board the massive US naval vessels entering the scene, earning international media attention. During this time period too, we also saw the mass closures of the key industries as I talked about previously, with one of the most famous sites being the pig iron works in Coatbridge, closing down in 1967. Even so, some key industries continued to operate, such as the steel industry, with the Ravenscraig steel mill modernized during the 60s and intended to be Scotland's industrial future, but it was mainly compounded by national policy decisions and structural issues with Scottish businesses. One key reason as to why was centralized nationalisation from London itself. The 1963 Beechin Act, hundreds of stations and thousands of railway lines to shut down. This affected Scotland significantly, which severely damaged rural communities and removed essential freight and passenger links. Lastly, for politics, the unemployment and emigration hit a considered high and was much higher than the UK average. The government and the Scottish Council for Development and Industry sought to attract new diversified industry, resulting in the establishment of the Highlands and Islands Development Board to help stimulate the local economy in those regions, but also the new car plants, which were US-owned based companies. Alongside the poor economic management by Westminster, the SNP had got a significant rise, and the public sought it as a political alternative to the Unionists. And speaking of Ravenscraig, we move on to new towns, with the most famous. And what was it called?
Cumbernauld, a new generation.
Cumbernauld is one of the most famous towns of this decade. It was a village, but by the New Towns Act, it was established as more of a town-like city. Why am I covering this? Well, maybe because I have known to be in Cumbernauld beforehand for educational reasons. Life in Cumbernauld was starting anew, and well, sadly, in the modern day, that is all no longer good. It is just pure garbage. I'm sorry about my little Cumbernauld rant, but I need it. At least it's better than Motherwell. Now then, enough talk about Motherwell slander and Cumbernauld superiority. We're moving on to the 1970s. The 1970s period was considered to be the breaking point for Scotland. During the second half of the decade, unemployment had doubled due to the much more accelerated deindustrialization. But during the first half of the decade, workers from the Upper Clyde shipbuilders, instead of striking due to the government announcement of the liquidation of the site, staged a famous work-in led by trade unionist Jimmy Reid, which ultimately proved very successful against the Conservative government at the time. Then of course there was the miners' strikes of 1972 and 1974, and the oil crisis in 1973. Due to bitter labor disputes and the national energy crisis, which led to the Conservative government introducing the 3-day week to conserve electricity. During the previous decade and the early 70s, oil was first discovered off the North Sea of Scotland. This had led to the oil boom, primarily around the city of Aberdeen, which quickly transformed itself from a struggling fishing port into the oil capital of Europe, sometimes even calling it the Texas of Europe. Due to the discovery of the oil, the SNP capitalized on this with a highly effective political slogan, "It's Scotland's oil," that the revenue should only benefit Scotland directly, not to be used to prop up the UK failing economy. And in the general election of 1974, the SNP made its first significant political force win, winning 11 seats. With the multiple wins that the SNP were now having, they forced the Labour government to propose a measure of self-government leading to the first modern devolution reform. With such famous events such as the Scotland Act of 1978, this act had proposed the creation of a Scottish Assembly with devolved powers. But unfortunately, many political failures led to a general election in May of 1979 that brought Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives back to power. And for more light-hearted topics, Scotland saw itself having a folk revival, with various bands such as Silly Wizard, the Tana Hill Weavers and the Battlefield Band commercializing traditional music into the modern world. This happened at the same time as pop/punk music was on the rise, such as the Bay City Rollers. Now then, we move on to the 1980s. The 1980s was plagued by the terror of the Conservative Party and Margaret Thatcher, despite the many policies that have greatly helped the nation. This included the mass deindustrialization and job losses, the miners' strikes from 1984 to 1985, the season of the North Sea oil revenue that was coming primarily through Scotland, and along with various other things such as the poll tax and opposition to Scottish devolution. Due to these events, it solidified a deep political divergence from the rest of the UK, which we will get into during the 90s. And quite famously, in culture and counter-narratives, famous band the Proclaimers putting together a song called Letter from America, which captured the pain of deindustrialization and emigration, such as the famous line, "Linwood no more, Bathgate no more, Irvine no more." On the 21st of December 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 took off from Frankfurt to Detroit by a stopover in London and another in New York City. But as it was passing over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, a device was activated and the entire plane was blown apart, killing all 259 people on board, along with 11 people on the ground of Lockerbie, which later gave rise to security systems set about in airports as of today, and serves as a great reminder as to what can happen in the event of improper inspections in airports. And finally, at long last, we arrive to the epilogue, the 1990s. The 1990s was the decade when Scotland overturned nearly 300 years of direct rule from Westminster. Following the failure of the 1979 referendum and of course the decade of Conservative power, a broad political consensus was formed between the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats and the SNP, which all supported some form of self-government. And in the previous decade, the Scottish Constitutional Convention produced its final blueprint for a devolved parliament, keeping the issue central to political debate. In 1997 was when the Labour Party, led under by Tony Blair, won the election. The Labour manifesto included a clear pledge for the Scottish Parliament to be formed. And in that same year was the referendum. It was a two-question referendum on devolution and was primarily held in Scotland. The first question was about the Parliament, with a majority of 74.3% saying yes. And the second question was that the Scottish Parliament should have the powers to levy tax, with an over 63% saying yes. The next year, in 1998, following the referendum, the UK Parliament passed the Scotland Act, establishing the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood, Edinburgh, and its powers. This legally formalised the new political era. Now, of course, there were some downsides, such as the end of steel with the closure of Ravenscraig Steelworks, closing down in 1992. Silicon Glen continued to grow in towns like Livingston and Dunfermline, which to this day is currently being expanded upon in other parts such as Glasgow, where they installed a new banking area. The tourism and cultural sectors became much more increasingly important, with events such as the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and other cultural bodies received greater investment, contributing to a much more diversified economy. Overall, this decade proved that Scotland can achieve its independence in some way, shape or form. Whether that was the failed 2014 referendum or the upcoming referendum as part by the SNP if they are to win 2026 general election for Scotland. Anyhow, I hope you all have enjoyed this secondary video as a lead up to the military video that I covered in part 1. Like what I said in part 1, I would like to thank you all yet again for a good 2025 of Norway. And I hope to see you all in 2026 with a good line of projects. And I hope to see you all in 2026 with a good streamline of projects. I promise I'll do more stuff, but yet again, there could be other events. God knows what can happen in that time period. Anyhow, if you like this video, please be sure to comment, like, share, or even subscribe to this channel. Thank you all very much.